Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about how to do literary analysis. I just wanted to give you a brief example of how to structure a paragraph within your essays when you're trying to analyze and explain a piece of literature. The first thing I want you to ask is, what am I arguing? What's my reasoning? Meaning, what are the pieces from the text that support your thesis or your argument? And then how can you organize those reasons? And your evidence should always, in a literary analysis, be quotations from the text itself and quotations from your secondary sources, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So I like this little graphic of teaching literary analysis. It tells students to choose a topic, focusing on an element that they find interesting. So what are some of the literary techniques used by the author that you find interesting? Then you focus in on that topic. When you focus in on the topic, you can gather your textual evidence and support for your thesis statement. This is a question, but that's a little bit more basic than what we're doing. So you gather things from the text and then from your secondary sources. You introduce the quotations, you analyze those quotations, and then you provide a conclusion for your essay. And again, what we're going to focus in on here today is how to structure internally those paragraphs where you're introducing the quotes and explaining them. So what you're going to do is start with primary sources. What is a primary source document? Well, it sort of depends if you're talking about literature or science or history. A primary source document can be a number of things. It can be a photograph, an artifact, a journal, an interview, census data, all of those things that are listed there. When we talk about primary source documents, we talk about the original material that was produced during the time period that we're examining. So for a literary analysis, that's going to be the original story or novel or poem or play. If you were looking at something like history, it might be an original letter that someone wrote. It just means that it's during that time period. I'm going to be using an example today of The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. So that's going to be our primary source. That means the first source. It was the original story written by the author. A secondary source is anything that examines a primary source. So history textbooks, for example, they look back at, I gave you the example of the letter. A history textbook would detail what was in those letters and look at letters and journals from the time to interpret what happened. Encyclopedias or biographies or reference books, editorials. But for literature, for the most part, these are going to be journal articles and websites that examine the primary sources. So they're things that are written by experts in the field of literature about stories and poems and novels and drama. So this is a little chart that shows you what a primary source does and what a secondary source does. Primary is the original. It was made during the time of the event. As I said, it's an original creation. For the humanities, that means art, literature, music, and disciplines of that type. A secondary source in the humanities analyzes or interprets those primary sources. So it's a second-hand account of the event. It's an interpretation or an analysis. Sometimes it could be something as simple as a summary. Sometimes it could go back and look at the author's life, or it could look at the piece of literature from a different perspective. So it might do a Marxist point of view on the literature or a feminist point of view on the literature, anything that analyzes literature from those aspects. So when you're first going to have a quotation from your primary source or from your secondary source, this is what I would like you to do. First, you introduce the text and and state your thesis in the beginning of your paper. When you go to write the quotation, you have to introduce it. You can't just drop it in. So who said it and what are their credentials? Then you cite the passage from the text and explain how it supports your thesis. Then you sum up your interpretation in light of your analysis. And finally, you document your sources. Now, this is something that you're going to be doing for your entire paper, and basically for each paragraph as well is going to be set up like this. You introduce the quote, you put the quote in, you analyze the quote, and you cite the quote. So here is the author's paper who allowed me to use her paper for this lecture. And her thesis was, "The narrator of The Black Cat" by Edgar Allan Poe is not a psychopath. He is an alcoholic, and the violence he commits is due to his drinking problem. This is a pretty basic thesis, but what I like about it is that it starts with introducing the story that we're looking at, The Black Cat, and then it makes an argument. Now, a lot of people who read this story just interpret the story to say that the narrator is crazy and unreliable. And her argument was that he's not actually crazy. He is his violence and his hallucinations and the violence he commits against his wife and against the black cat are all due to his drinking problem. So I'm going to show you the piece of the story, here we go, that she used. This is just the paragraph from the primary source. And she takes the primary source and quotes it. The narrator explains, "I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language toward my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence." Now you can see here we have the quotation with the proper citation. The narrator explains, comma, introducing the quote. Then we have the quote from "I grew until personal violence." And then we have the citation. It's in parentheses. These are called parenthetical citations because they occur in parentheses in the document of your paper. It has the author's last name, Poe, and then the page number, 255. Excuse me. So after she has this quotation, now she's going to analyze it. And this is a picture to say, here's how to analyze a quotation. You have the tag, again, who's saying it, the speaker and the context. So sometimes you might say who the narrator is, or if it's an expert, if it's a secondary source, you might tell who they are. You can paraphrase the quotation or break it down. But really what I'd like you to be doing for these papers is showing me the deeper meaning and significance. So if you have a quotation, don't just tell me what they said, but really tell me what that quotation means. What's the significance of it? How does it tie back into your thesis? So here's our example. Poe uses point of view as a literary technique to bring us into the narrator's warped mind. Here, meaning in the quotation we just read, the narrator explains the effects of alcoholism. As he drank more and more, he began to treat his wife poorly, eventually hitting her. Later in the story, he becomes violent toward animals as well. At that point in time in history, there were no programs for rehab or Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholism could cause personality changes and even hallucinations. Now, in her explanation here, she sort of goes back over and paraphrases what we just read, and then she begins to add some historical notes about alcoholism, and that she's going to tie into one of her secondary sources that she uses. So I'm going to show you next a paragraph. This is one of her secondary sources, and you can see her highlights here. This is not, there's two secondary sources. So here's the first one. This is the one that shows historical notes, secondary source 1. Andrew Corbet wrote about alcoholism and prohibition. He says, at that time, many Americans wanted alcohol to be illegal because it was thought to be, and here's her quote, the root cause of much crime, domestic violence, poverty, workplace injury and absenteeism, and sexual assaults. And then she has it properly cited again, Courbet 61. I thought this was a great source to use because it's a secondary source, not about the particular story, which could be sometimes hard to find, but just about the historical background that helps us understand the story better. And here's her secondary source, number 2, Anne Bliss, Masculinity and the Black Cat. She tells us Anne Bliss is an expert on Edgar Allan Poe and has published 2 books on the author. Bliss believes the narrator's actions in this story are due to his failure to be masculine. However, she admits that, quote, he performs increasingly violent acts, blaming his actions on his consumption of alcohol. He becomes violent toward his wife and toward his pets. So here we have the introduction of the quote, telling me who said it and why I should listen to her. And then the quote, a little bit of summary, and then the quote itself, and then the citation. So we've had and then we analyze in the next paragraph. So what's great about what she's done here is she's provided us one secondary source with historical background, and then another secondary source specifically analyzing the primary source, that is specifically looking at the story. And after she gives a quote, then she analyzes it. So she says, Bliss's argument demonstrates alcohol is the reason for the narrator's actions. The narrator is unreliable, but given the historical details provided by Courbet, alcoholism is responsible for his unemployment, his violence toward his wife, his violence toward his pet, and his eventual hallucinations. One example of a hallucination occurs, which is our transition to the next paragraph. So here what we're looking at is all those pieces put together. So first she starts out with a topic sentence. One example of the narrator's alcoholism can be found in the beginning of the story when the narrator begins to drink more and blames and becomes intemperate in his drinking. He explains, and then she has the quote. Poe uses point of view as a literary technique. That's her analysis of the quote. Later in the story, he becomes violent. Alcoholism could cause personality changes and hallucinations. And then she gives the first secondary source. So you can see in that first paragraph, we have the topic sentence, the quotation, the analysis, and the secondary source that backs up her analysis. In the second paragraph, that's the quotation from Anne Bliss, where we introduce the author of the secondary source. We have the quotation there. And then again, we have a little bit of analysis on that quotation before transitioning to her next point. So this is how you should structure your literary arguments. You introduce your quotations, you have a quotation from the text, analyze it, use a secondary source to back up your point, and then analyze the secondary source. What I'd really like you to remember while you're writing is that writing a literary analysis should be an argument. It's not just repeating the plot or giving a review of the short story or the novel, or eventually when we write later, the poem or the play. And you're not giving a review of it, meaning you're not just evaluating it to tell me what you liked or didn't like. Instead, what you're doing is forming an argument about how to interpret that piece of literature. And the quotations you pick from the primary source and your secondary sources should all support that argument. So that's it. Happy writing.